In that perception alone are men and women free of the alien. That awareness is always now, timeless. Before the alien gained its existence, there was no time, no interval. Everything was and is now. Man perceived the beauty or reality of the earth direct, through his awareness now, the eternal now within him. So there was no self-consciousness, no self-interest, no ignorant and unhappy subconscious to provide the notion of time, reflection, past, or the continuity of existence. No psychic world between mankind and the beautiful earth. Everything was and is immediate, discontinuous, ever new, the eternal consciousness of the earth itself, present in man's perception, as man's perception. With no past existence or subconscious between the earth and the eternal, there was no evolution. Only when the alien force of time entered man's awareness and attached him to impressions of the past did evolution or change start to occur. From then on, he started to lose his inner awareness, his one and only good sense, his perception of the one and only good. As the alien was intolerable to timeless consciousness, it was instantly ejected. So it formed subconsciousness, the human subconscious on top of the timeless consciousness. However, the alien intelligence had formed an impression in itself, in time, of the timeless sense of the one and only good. As it was only an impression of the good, it was not the real thing. It differentiated necessarily into several secondary goods, secondary senses which in time appeared as the physical sense organs of hearing, tasting, smelling, seeing, and touch-feeling. This manifestation of the senses marked the beginning of the evolution of the species and the externalization on Earth of a physical world. Thus, there are three realms of existence, one on top of the other: eternal consciousness, subconsciousness, and physical consciousness. It took immense epochs of unhappiness, the suffering of all life in time, to evolve what we now know as the 5 human sense organs, fixed in the head as the ears, eyes, nose, palate, and skin. Like stalks, they emerge from the human brain, itself the product of time, past pain, and the same evolutionary trauma that produced all the Earth's mortal or sense-perceived creatures. The Earth as we know it, in its familiar shape and form, is also externalized in time. It is the physical externalization, 2 levels up, of the pristine terrestrial psyche, the timeless and the changeless, the eternal. Once externalized through the senses, the earth image and human psyche entered time and change, and evolution began. Immediately, the manifested earth, representing the previously joyous human psyche, reenacted with cataclysmic violence the agonizing effect of the invasion of unhappiness. The evolutionary evidence of these primordial convulsions and the successive upheavals are preserved today in the dramatic rock formations of the Earth's surface. Geological history represents the petrification in stone of the fundamental unhappiness in the human psyche and the existence that came out of it. The evolution of unhappiness continues to be demonstrated in the Earth. Just a few miles below the solid crust, a fiery ocean of molten rock, like the endless unhappiness seething in the tormented human psyche, intermittently boils to the surface with uncontrollable, destructive force. The geophysical evolution or manifestation of Earth is for the time being stable and could be said to be complete. So is the organic evolution of the species that culminated in the human brain and body. When the physical realm was complete, the alien unhappiness evolved in a new medium. Mankind's unhappy brain with its fears, doubts, violence, cruelty, greed, loneliness, depression, anger, and despair. The multitudes of emotion in the subconscious were externalized in the people of the earth as the unconscious masses. Amassed unconsciousness. As men and women find comfort, excitement, and a personal identity in their multitudinous emotions, so they hide from the truth of themselves in the unconscious activities of the masses. But the masses do not exist. Like the unhappiness they represent, they are only a reassuring dream of the human brain, a notion that evolved out of the instinctive animal brain which finds safety and identity in the herd. In the unconscious dream of the masses, man and woman can cling to unhappiness until they die, unable to exist as individuals. In living, they never really come to life. They only think they do. They live not as individuals, but through the instinct and notion of the herd. Only the individual has the power to come to life in existence beyond the herd. There is no hope for the herd. The masses have no hope. The masses always live on hope. In the modern Western world, it was thought that democracy would make everybody happy, hopefully. The introduction of representative democracy was the first concerted attempt by unhappy people to make themselves happy. Through the democratic vote, each man could express his unhappiness by choosing an unhappy man or party to express his unhappiness for him to other unhappy parties. These unhappy parties working unhappily together would produce happiness. That was the notion. That was the hope. Getting the vote did indeed allow the unhappy masses to express their unhappiness. But as the masses do not exist, predictably their vote has no effect. Thus men were no happier, their unhappiness no less. Then, less than a century ago, they suddenly discovered that the other sex, the female partner in unhappiness, did not exist democratically. So they gave her unhappiness the vote too. Now everyone could express their unhappy choice, and everyone would be happy, it was hoped. But that didn't work either. Man and woman were still unhappy. So both sexes got busy. As woman tried to contribute her unhappiness to the non-existent happiness of democracy, man proudly extolled its merits to unhappy natives of other lands who, like himself, do not really exist. They were so busy working out their unhappy self-interest that they utterly failed to grasp the awful truth of what they had done. All power comes from the people. Through representative democracy, man and woman had willingly handed over responsibility for their unhappiness for all time. In all the thousands of years of trying to cope with unhappiness, man had never done anything so foolish or irresponsible. There had been a gradual, creeping transition towards this point, but now with one seemingly progressive act, individuality of man and woman disappeared into the ignorance of the masses. Throughout the ages, violent and unhappy men had destroyed or seized possessions, tortured enemies, and taken slaves. Under countless unhappy kings and tyrants, man had accepted his unhappy lot, accepted it as his own, and dealt with it in himself as best he could. He had never voluntarily given other unhappy men the right to make him unhappy. But now he had done it. In fact, throughout his long history, man frequently died to keep that right, that extraordinary inner responsibility or power, rather than surrender it to anyone. He called it his honor or integrity. That power to him was God. In that power alone resided his individuality. And only he, the individual, could answer for it or to it. None other than he. For this was not a notional God or good, as God or good is today. It was a living state, a being within, the being of himself, the unmistakable presence of his own rightfulness. In those earliest of days, life as the feeling of being alive was far more vital in man. He was not the mental creature, living mostly in his head, that he is today. He possessed far less notional and theoretical information about living, far more knowledge of life, self-knowledge. He was informed from within. But over the centuries, as he slowly degenerated towards the folly of democracy and the notion that freedom could be attained through others, he became aware of a growing inner unworthiness, battling with his inner rightfulness. This was like being two opposing living realities at the same time. And due to his more conscious state, it was more intensely real to him than we can know today. After a long interval of further degeneration from consciousness to self-consciousness, man called this inner struggle his conscience. By then the struggle was no longer real. Because he now lacked the inner knowledge of the one good, the struggle of his conscience was little more than a confused contest between the various notions of good and bad that others had planted in him. From a spiritual struggle deep in his vital being, it had deteriorated into an emotional struggle on the mental surface of himself. While the struggle was still vital, man had a continuous experience of the invading force of unhappiness, the mortal in himself, literally grappling like a wrestler with his inner power, the immortal or eternal in himself. He was both combatants simultaneously, both the force and the power, and while the battle raged, did not know which would win. But he was always aware that it was a life and death struggle. It was extremely painful at times, as though he was being killed. And yet out of that dying, when the power temporarily overwhelmed the force, came a spiritual awareness of the ineffable sweetness and beauty of life or reality within him, his integrity. Man lived with death within him. Death was a constant presence, not the cessation of activity, but an extraordinary energetic activity, and when he faced it, alone as he must face it within, he won the battle. Death brought life. In this inner death and dying was salvation. Living with the presence of death within enabled man to know the living reality of life within. Honor, integrity, living power, living God, living good. For only in the face of death are honor and integrity realized, made real as oneself. Man and woman today have little opportunity and even less inclination to die for their integrity or honor, the one good, the one God within. Today they die for democracy, the God without, or some similar notion of a good or God outside themselves. The introduction of democracy marked the end of man's inner fight for life. Men and women chose to no longer live with death within. It was too painful and inconvenient. Death had won. and man gave up the ghost. He surrendered unconditionally to the outer good, or God, the notional existence of the masses. The ghost, his false impression of himself, stepped out of his body and attached itself to a new body, the body politic, the notion that he was one of the mass of everybody. Now his power and integrity could only be expressed through force and emotion. He would have to fight for what he thought was right. Whenever he did so, it would be misunderstood, bringing more unhappiness upon himself and everybody else. Since man had abandoned the reality of himself for the dream of mass salvation, the massed unconscious now took over with its popular notions and emotions. What was popular was what mattered, not what was right. Individuality was being superseded. The chance of an individual discovering the truth and having the power to rid himself of unhappiness was enormously reduced. Such individuality was not popular. The individual within was dead. God was dead. The disease of death spread outwards. Life on earth was dying. The more it died, the more the disease, the masses, lived and multiplied. And the more the masses lived and multiplied, the more they killed life on earth. All power comes from the people, as all unhappiness derives from the power of the people who have surrendered to the force. The democratically elected unhappy politicians were now responsible for man and woman's unhappiness, and they did the job well. They made men and women very unhappy.